Here's a guy to make some silly arguments for the global flood.
In the center of the United States, we find hundreds and hundreds of dinosaur graveyards. Each one of these dots that you see represents a graveyard that contains sometimes hundreds of thousands of fossils. Many of these dinosaurs are found fully intact, and we've discovered that they died from choking on mud.
I don't know where Matt gets this information, but if it's true, it wouldn't be surprising for many fossils to be of animals that died that way, given that being deposited in mud creates a better chance of fossilization. It slows decomposition and keeps the bones from being carried off by scavengers.
And so you have to ask the question, what could cause a tsunami so big that it would encompass the entire United States, or at least half of the United States, and bury hundreds of thousands of creatures and sea life together, all in one large event?
Where do you get the idea that these dinosaurs died all in one large event? Why couldn't they have gotten buried in mud in lots of little events over the course of millennia? Why would it have to be a tsunami from the coast rather than localized floods and mudslides?
There is no other option other than a global flood. And in order to get a fossil, you have to have rapid burial. And so that's the only explanation why we would find these dinosaurs buried and preserved in the positions that we find them.
Yeah, they had to be buried rapidly, but there are lots of ways to get buried rapidly. You don't need one big flood. The dinosaurs could have been buried rapidly in lots of little ordinary floods and mudslides.
And within some of these dinosaurs, we find preserved blood cells. Now, the blood cells were analyzed by different scientists, and we've found that they actually died from drowning.
I don't know where he gets this info either, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's true because, as I already mentioned, rapid burial in a flood or a mudslide creates the best conditions for fossil preservation. That doesn't mean that there needed to be a global flood that buried all of these dinosaurs all at once.
And so, once again, you have to ask the question, what could cause waves so huge that they would hit in the center of the United States, all the way from the oceanic coast?
No, I don't have to ask that question, because you don't need huge waves to come in from the oceanic coast in order for an animal to get buried under some mud in a mudslide or a flood. Rivers and lakes exist. Also, coastlines move over time. Even if some of these dinosaurs were buried in a tsunami, it may have been during a time when the oceanic coast wasn't nearly as far from the Midwest as it is now.
Noah's flood is the explanation for these things. In fact, it is the only explanation.
Why couldn't ordinary floods and mudslides be the explanation? I suppose if you assume these dinosaurs all died at once, you might need a global flood to explain it, but where are you getting the idea that they all died at once?
And this is why we find whales perfectly preserved on top of mountains. Now, how could whales have possibly gotten to the top of certain mountains?
Some of the land that's at the top of mountains now was at the bottom of the ocean a long time ago. I'm sure that Matt has heard this explanation before. It's common knowledge at this point, but he apparently can't be bothered to even attempt to rebut it.
This is also why we find whales in the desert.
Places that are desert now were not always desert. This shouldn't be a surprise even to a young Earth creationist, because bodies of water can dry up and desertify even on pretty short timescales. That's why you can also find ships in the middle of the desert. Do you think these 20th century fishing boats were deposited in the desert by Noah's flood?
This is why we find clams that are in the closed position that were catastrophically buried on top of Mount Everest, 29,000 feet above sea level.
It was not always above sea level.
We also find trees going through all of the different layers of supposed geologic time. People think that these layers are millions of years of different time zones.
Different time zones? Does Greenwich Mean Time have its own fossil layer?
If you have a tree that was placed there at the time of the formation of the layers around it, that means that the layers are not millions of years of different ages.
It means that the layers around those particular trees were not deposited over the course of millions of years. The fact that some sedimentary strata can be laid down quickly does not mean that all fossil layers were. Some are young and some are very old. As Gutsick Gibbon explains,
well, the conditions that lead to polystrate fossils are actually very well understood. They are formed by rare to infrequent brief episodes of rapid sedimentation separated by long periods of either slow deposition, non-deposition, or a combination of both. We see these kinds of burials today and have uncovered upright trees in places like the Mississippi River Delta, marshes, extensive floodplains, and more. Annual floods, local volcanic disasters, or even the slow incursion of a coast can and does result in polystrate fossils.
Since we still see this kind of thing happening in ordinary floods today, we don't need one big global flood to explain it.
We also find coal deposits that are over 100 feet thick. Now, coal comes from vegetation and different organisms that have been smashed together between sediments. How in the world are you going to get a coal deposit that's over 100 feet thick?
Gradually, over millions of years. Why would this need to be caused by a global flood?
This shows us that the pre-flood world was extremely lush. There was a lot of vegetation. There was large animals, dinosaurs, that were all buried together with trees and with different organic materials and creating massive, massive amounts of coal. Now, mountains themselves are great proof of Noah's flood. If you look at the layers of some of these mountains, you'll notice that all of the layers are bent. You cannot bend hard rock.
Yes, you can bend hard rock. Rock is very brittle, but it is not perfectly brittle. It does have some elasticity.
If I squeeze this, I can actually squeeze the sides of this rock together, and when I let go, it comes back again. That's the definition of something being elastic. Rocks are elastic. Actually, all solids are elastic.
Matt apparently never bothered to ask a geologist whether the kinds of rock that make up these mountains can actually bend.
That means that all of these layers were moist when they were laid down, and then when the plates were moving, they were bent upwards as all of them were pliable and all of them solidified together in one event.
Even if these rocks were softer at the time that they formed the bends, why do you infer that all of the bent rock layers all over the planet had to form all at once?
According to humanists, the plates on the Earth have only been moving about 1 to 2 inches per year.
Yes, as a humanist, I base all of my geological measurements on the principles of humanism.
And these plates slowly create the mountains as one slides under the other plate. This could not have happened. These mountain ranges that we see would have shattered and broken. They would have eroded flat. You cannot bend hard rock.
Again, yes, you can bend hard rock, but even if you couldn't, if rock is piling on top of rock, it would still create a mountain even if it did break into shards. Why would it erode flat? Wouldn't soft rock be more likely to erode flat than unbendably hard rock?
All of these rocks that we see on these mountains were all soft and moist at the time of their formation. And that's why they're all perfectly bent many times. And you can see these beautiful photos of mountain ranges that show that they were created by a catastrophic flood and not millions of years of geological time.
Even if it were the case that rock couldn't bend, why would it need to be bent during a catastrophic flood? Why couldn't they have formed in ordinary floods?
And that's why you find polystrata fossils connecting all the layers.
Polystrata fossils do not connect all the layers. They only connect the layers that solidify around them, which is not all the layers that exist.
So that's why you find whales on mountains, clams on mountains, sea life on every single mountain on Earth.
No, the reason you find sea life fossils on mountains is because mountains are formed by rock layers being forced upward from a lower position, sometimes from the bottom of an ocean.
Why? Because the earth was flooded. Because by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. Because the world that then was, that was overflowed with water, perished.
Even a lot of the world that was already underwater would have perished, because the saltwater oceans would have mixed with the freshwater lakes and rivers, killing all of the freshwater fish. So why do we still have freshwater fish? Did they all evolve after the flood? Oh yeah, that's right, that explanation isn't allowed under your worldview.
And I think that the most powerful argument of all is the fact that we find 10-mile thick pieces of rock from the Earth's crust that have been subducted rapidly 500 miles down into Earth's hot molten mantle. This rock that we've found that's 10 miles thick It's still cold even though it's surrounded by 5,000 degree molten rock. Now, could cold rock be sitting down in 5,000 degree temperatures for millions of years?
Who's claiming that subducted rock has been sitting under the crust for millions of years? Subduction isn't something that happened only once millions of years ago. It's something that is still happening. The cooler subducted rock could be newly subducted rock.
There's no way. That's not physically possible. The only way you get cold rock that's 10 miles thick from the crust into the mantle of the Earth is from catastrophic breaking up of the plates and plates going under one another and literally getting subducted down. And if they're still cold, then it means that they have not been there that long.
If that graphic is supposed to indicate the location of colder parts of the mantle, they clearly weren't the result of subduction at all, because they're in the middle of the North American plate. Subduction between the plates only happens between the edges of the plates, not right in the middle.
This catastrophic event of the plates moving extremely fast, continental sprint, did in fact happen.
Citation needed.
And they were rapidly subducted, these 10-mile thick pieces of rock. And if that happened today, that would cause a global flood. Imagine, just for a minute, if you had a 10-mile thick piece of rock that was broken up from the crust, that subducted. That's how we even get earthquakes, is by rocks and stuff sliding around and the crust of the earth sliding into different positions. That would have created another global flood if something like that happened today.
How do you figure? It would cause a lot of tsunamis, but how did you calculate that it would cause the oceans to completely cover the entire planet? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.